Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP 1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pinpoint Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to providing cybersecurity leadership and guidance to MSPs and their clients. Think of us as your virtual CISO or security advisor. Head on over to pinpointsolutions.com to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by James Bowers of Input Output. Welcome, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So this episode is uniquely titled Define the Why. So we give a shout out to Simon Sinek because that's obviously his key, one of his signature phrases. But in this particular case, I think it's relatively unique in the sense that we're going to talk about risk. Now, you and I recently met through LinkedIn, and a conversation that you and I had last week was really about the difference or the complement between the two of us that we got talking about. And that is, I focus very heavily on addressing gaps with controls, with security standards, those types of things, and going in and saying, hey, this product solves that problem. Here's how we address it. And you really opened my eyes up to the piece that I don't enjoy doing, and that is determining or defining the risk, which gets into the why we're doing this, right? So James, for our audience, if you could just kind of start the conversation for us with why you said this to me, Chris, we've got to define the why.
Yeah, no, and again, I appreciate you having me on and setting it up there. And for anybody that's not read Simon Sinek, please go out there, do so. Wonderful, great videos. And for those of you that have, this is loosely based on that. Please don't call in and hate if there's some deviations from what he's saying. He's the inspiration here, not right. the guideline. But when we get into looking at security compliance, the things we do as MSPs, we all have a lot of knowledge, and we tend to jump right into just identifying all the different ways, all the different gaps, and we're problem solvers. We want to get in and fix all these problems, and oh, we don't have EDR, and oh, we don't have a SIM solution, and oh, we don't have this.
Right.
And from the customer perspective, we don't really identify the why is that ultimately important. And we may identify that first why. Well, it's we have to have a SIM because otherwise we won't know if there's an attack. Okay, but why is that important? Well, because somebody could be breaking into the network and stealing some information. Okay, well, why is that important to me? As we continue to get down, we really need to identify what's the ultimate why in the business. What's the core need? And where I've noticed and where I talk to a lot of organizations about is we need to fully understand our business. Where are we going in this next year? Where are we going in the next 3 and 5 years? And then when we understand that, we can really identify what are our core needs. And then that helps us drive those conversations of why we need some of the solutions that, Chris, that you're talking to people about. Hey, you are looking to provide this healthcare solution, and you're wanting to be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Here's some of the threats to that, the quote unquote risk. Here's the solution that's going to drive that why. It kind of marries what it is that you're providing and helps have a conversation that they can understand. I guess perhaps in the marketing world, the WIFM, the what's in it for me. Right. Here's what's in it. Here's what's in it for you. And here's why it's important. In Mr. and Mrs. Customer, if you don't find that important, let's identify that why. What is important there so that we can tweak the what that we're presenting to you. That's a big umbrella kind of high level overview of it.
So ultimately, in respects to risk, by using terms like defining the why, we're kind of avoiding having a conversation where we get into using words like risk and tolerance and, whether or not we're going to ignore it, embrace it, remediate it, because at the end of the day, no one really wants to have that conversation. But when we have a conversation that says why, or not to deviate from why, but like what's important to your business comes back to the why we're going to do the following things, right? And then the how and what that's going to look like, that becomes really sort of a unique, I don't want to say snowflake, but I think each business has sort of this outcome that is going to be tied to their needs, not necessarily my needs. And I think that's one of the areas where, as we've gone through a lot of the episodes in this series, has basically been my why is not the same as my client's why, and more often than not it's not even going to be very closely aligned. And so one of the challenges we get into is defending why I'm doing something in my company, but then telling you as the client or prospective client that you need to do this too. And I think when we get into that, define the why, of course there could be the your why and my why can align in certain areas even though they don't align in all of them. Things like firewall, antivirus, some of those things we all kind of say we both need those, right? What
Mhm.
becomes problematic is when I decide that my operations and my size of company is going to, be the same equipment that I'm going to put in yours. And I think for the most part, MSPs have gotten pretty strong at scale and those types of things and making sure that it's the right fit. But I think that we get into this defense mechanism kicks in when we talk to a client and they're like, well, why do I need that? Because we haven't started the conversation with the client telling me what they believe they actually need.
Yeah, I think that it hits the nail on the head to where what makes it even more difficult is people aren't really able to articulate that language typically either. As you're having this friction, as you're trying to explain to the client why they need a certain solution, and you're getting frustrated because this client just doesn't get it. They're being cheap. They just don't want to spend money. Kind of some of the things that go through our head. And from the other side, the client's thinking this MSP is just trying to sell me stuff I don't need, or
Sure.
they don't get me. They don't really understand our business. They're not able to articulate that to say, what I think the problem here is we haven't really defined where we're wanting to take our business and why any of this should be important.
Right.
We're staying in that outside lane, which we're talking two different languages.
Right.
Where when you come to the business and say, well, let's first identify what is it that you do and why are you doing that? And sometimes that seems like a silly question, but that it's really important to dive down into is what's your mission? What did you build this business for? And what are your actual objectives? What KPIs are you wanting to hit? What things are you wanting to make sure that you do? And then on top of that, what are your obligations? So when you have that why, like you said, a lot of people don't want to have that risk, reward, impact, tolerance. They don't want to have that conversation. It's not sexy for everybody.
Right.
Um,
And
you
you
know,
just started with risk appetite there, where you're talking about KPIs and like where we're going
yeah.
with target goals, those types of things. I think that's the one area that I think they can kind of have a conversation around is the appetite portion. We say we
Mhm.
don't want any risk, but when we start talking about like where the business is going, those types of things, we can really quickly visualize as a business where I want to take this company, knowing full well what those risks might be. But when you go into where you just started down the next step, which is that tolerance and risk avoidance, those types of things, where now we're getting into some areas that are really difficult to have a conversation about if we don't have a real understanding of the industry or the vertical within the industry. The two doc practice versus a hospital are dramatically different environments, right? But that
Mhm.
doesn't mean the approach isn't the same.
No, I think this ties back to in getting into the whiffle of perhaps everybody listening is you have those breakdowns when you're talking to some customers, and this ties to it to where Mr. and Mrs. Customer, what's your availability need? How often could you go down? And the customer says, well, never. We need to be
Right.
up 24/7. And so you go down the path of that. But a 24/7 availability for even a small client might be $1 million a year worth of redundant servers and solutions and DRP solutions. And when you tell the customer that, say, well, we could probably be down for like 2 weeks. How much would that cost?
Right.
It's a different conversation. So this ties to that, to be able to make sure that you and the client, the business, are all on the same path and understanding what do we really need to meet our business goals,
Right.
and what would keep us from being able to do that, so that we as MSPs, as technology providers, can guide them in the appropriate way, so that we're not just selling stuff that meets a need that we think they have, or that we just enjoy ourselves.
Right. So so you said the can you say the catchphrase you use? Because I'm the waffle. Did you say the waffle
Oh,
factor?
the WIFM.
The
It's called
whiffum.
the yeah WIIFM. What's in it for me?
Got it.
Uh,
Whiffum. Because I was
and
thinking like Woofy Factor, which is a book
yeah,
that's out there that's all about identifying your social media brand. What's the what's the hype, right? So that I was trying to like wrap my, I'm like, this sounds like a book, but no, now I understand what you're saying. With them, what's in it for me? That's like the FOMA also comes into play, the fear of, or FOMO, the fear of missing out, right? Like
uh-huh.
I hear that one a lot, and I'm like, as MSPs, do we have FOMO? And I think absolutely we do. And it comes right back to this risk conversation that we're having,
Mhm.
defining the why, because our fear of missing out is there a product out there that will solve this problem? Do I not know about something that I should know about? And it's like, yeah, but if you're going to live in that space, you're never going to have the products and services you need to fill in all your gaps.
Yeah, that's I think us all in this space have that same fear, ties to some of the imposter syndrome that a lot probably have, which also relates to, I want to make sure everything's 100% perfect. And I think, as a side, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, or adequate.
Right.
Definitely as it comes to client spending and such. Um, but again, it goes back to defining that why, so that you can have a conversation, so that when you make a recommendation, you can go back to what the client say their why was. Hey, this meets that need, and
Right.
here's why we're doing this. And obviously, if we need to change it, we can, but it all comes back to what the client said, which is a nice little safety net too.
So you and I come at this a little bit from two sides of the same coin, and we both have the necessity of doing the define the why, but for sort of different approaches, or at different places in solving client needs, or even our own internal needs as it pertains to risk. So for our audience, this is kind of important as we kind of start really using words like risk in the conversation, and not having to stay in the why space.
Mhm.
I think about, some of the things that we struggle with secure outcomes in the MSP-Ignite program, where we're trying to help MSPs with their security maturity, addressing things like, I need a policy for that, how to write a policy, how to understand what the policy is going to do for them. And by and large, the area that I haven't put time in with them is, uh, how did we come to this conclusion that this is what we're going to address in my organization? Because the reality is, it's going to be different for each of us. And the important thing is that if we know what our risks are, then how we go about tackling the CIS controls like we're using, that becomes, I don't want to say easy, but it at least shapes the journey at the beginning of where we need to focus. CIS says, start with controls 1 through 5. Now they've added control 6 as part of that sort of
Mhm.
linear, go this way. And while that's fine and dandy, that doesn't necessarily mean that when we get into those sub controls, particularly because now you've got quite a few more to work through, that those are going to line up on the risk factor of where I should be spending time and addressing them. And to your point, you said, trying to do things with perfection doesn't necessarily imply that mediocre or okay isn't good enough right now, because most of us are operating from we have nothing
Mm-hmm.
and we're stuck with nothing because we're going after great or perfect. And so we get stuck with nothing because until I've got it polished to be great, I'm not sharing this with anybody.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a concern. And one thing to consider too is, God, but by the time you got it perfect, if you ever actually could, because I'm sure all of us would find a way to nitpick it even more, especially our own work. Things change. The market has changed. There's new solutions out there, and now it doesn't. It's not even relevant. Um, but definitely going back to the risk, and the CIS 20 is a phenomenal framework. But it comes back first that you have to understand the risk in your business so you know which of these controls apply to us.
Right.
Because at its core, it's a framework. It provides a really good guideline as, hey, here are the things that you should be doing, but not necessarily that these are what you have to be doing. These are good best practices as long as they relate to your business and to your risk. And if they don't spend the money on it or the headache.
And if they're not, uh, done, if even if they're relevant but not done, doesn't necessarily equate to you have a problem because you didn't address that control. I mean,
Mhm.
controls are only going to be problematic having not been addressed if something that would line up with being at the why I'm putting this control in were to take place. And obviously everybody is now sort of concerned. We've had the the SolarWinds debacle, the different vendors claiming that I had this compromise or that, and so all of us are highly sensitive. We're no longer desensitized to it. Just happens to everybody. Now we're really sensitive to even the topic, because as soon as it comes up, it's like, well, what things can I do besides nothing, because nothing still equates to something bad happened and I didn't do anything
Mhm.
about it. What does that look like? And to your policies comment, I had made some notes. I was working with somebody a couple weeks ago on policies, and we were just talking about what's the life cycle of a policy, not from like start to end, like where a policy gets archived because it's no longer relevant, like what you might see in the SANS Institute, where they've archived policies that they don't feel are relevant. That doesn't necessarily mean those policies aren't relevant to me. SANS Institute is just saying we're not going to continue to work on these policies because it's as perfect as it's going to get for now and for always, unless something changes, and then we'll pull it back out of those archives. But it was essentially saying that policies in year one are going to see a lot of transformation as you figure out all those risk components, as you figure out what controls realistically you can address, those kind of things. Then you get into like second and third, like reiterations of those policies. That may not be for another 18 months to 2 years that they're seeing really any sort of change, because you kind of got that initial one right after, doing it over and over again, because we're so worried about getting it right the first
Mhm.
time. And I think one of the things that needs to change in that model is that we need to worry about getting a draft with the most ambiguity, with like, I know that these things that are in there, even though it's kind of vague, we're doing them and my employees understand that we're doing them, and then worry about refinement in that second year instead of having it change so rapidly at the beginning, because it's like no one made us experts on policies the first time we write them, so let's not try to be experts on the ones we adopt out of the gate. And then the second part was thinking about the things that we kind of glaze over that aren't part of the security space. So things like an employee handbook or some sort of HR acceptable use document as it pertains to maybe physical access, or any number of things that aren't necessarily quote cybersecurity specific. And you find like, well, those have been around for years. So when you talk about an employee handbook, that might not get modified for 4 or 5 years after initial adoption. And then I was explaining this to someone else the other day. It's like, there's perfection in employee handbooks out there, right? They've been written for way before we ever even had the word
Mhm.
cybersecurity on our radar. This stuff has existed. So don't beat yourself up when you go, hey, I've got an employee handbook and I've got these acceptable use policies or even a password policy. And now I'm struggling with how do I do these more asset inventory and baseline security configurations. That's because all of us are relatively new to writing these policies because 5 years ago, no one cared.
Mm-hmm.
No one had to care 5 years ago, right? We didn't have the challenges that we do today 5 years ago, at least not in our faces.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't. It was there.
Right.
Just we weren't creating the stuff for it. I guess when it comes to policies, definitely don't recreate the wheel and work in spaces that you understand. I do a lot of policies and procedures. I don't create employee handbooks. I leave that to HR because
Right.
there's law and everything. And full disclaimer, should have said it before. I don't ever provide legal advice. Um,
What?
we'll flash that on the screen. I don't ever provide legal advice.
You stayed in
So I don't
Holiday Inn
give
Express lately? I mean, we could use that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just some lanes I don't get into.
Okay.
Um, but with the policies, you're right. It comes down to the first to split it up into bite-sized pieces to where create an organizational policy. What's the kind of must-haves? What are the directives? And that's where the risk comes in. Where are
Right.
we going as a business? So what do we need to identify? What do we need to do? And then create your procedures. All right, now how are we going to do that? What are we going to do to make sure we're satisfying that why? And that starts making it a lot more manageable.
Right.
I also always like to point out with policies is you typically should be shaving them down, much like in engineering. Let's figure out how we can continue to make this smaller and with less parts and with less pieces, but still work and secure us just the same. Because if you're going the other way and you keep mushing stuff on, it eventually becomes this big monster that you just can't manage or that you don't want to. And then it just sits in a closet that you never actually look at it.
So, for clarification, if I think about policies as a whole, how I put together, say, a password management plan or a password policy is in and of itself a policy, even though it might be a subcontrol that's being addressed. That's part of a bigger policy. Is that fair? Like we want to get to the point where what I might present to an auditor, I might have on the high end, say 20 of these policies that really don't get into every single subcontrol we're addressing outside of saying it's being addressed. But then which gets into those policies don't change as frequently because as if I've got two-factor authentication and it's a policy, it might change every 6 to 12 months if that were the case. I mean, we've seen the apps that have come into the 2FA space just sort of explode overnight. You swap one product out and you've just changed a policy.
Mhm.
So, but at the higher level, talking about, privileged access and those types of things, that could be relatively vague. Is that fair? Like we're talking about keep it vague, and then may have granular type policies that are 1 or 2 pages and they live on their own, but they're also a part of and referenced by a sort of parent policy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So there's kind of typically a hierarchy that you want to have, and you have an organizational policy at the top. And that's kind of the ivory tower. That's your mandate. This is what we have to do, our minimum baselines. And that's what you typically talk about with upper management.
Would that
You
be
get
like your
there
WISP, the written information security plan would be that?
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
that'd be the very, very, very top part.
Sure.
But it's pretty vague. It may
Right.
say we need to have two-factor authentication. That's it. Maybe just one line. I'm not going to explain how we do it
Right.
or anything but beyond that, but just we have to have 2FA. Then you may have some actual procedures. Maybe you utilize IT glue or some other solution to have a section in there that says, how do we actually do two-factor authentication? Perhaps what do we use?
Right.
And that can be typically you'll do procedures if something's a little bit tricky to where what if I got hit by a bus? Could I have somebody else come in here and manage this for me? And that's normally where I'd have procedures for. Um, and then even beyond that, advisory policies, which is what you give to employees and such. Hey, your
Sure.
acceptable use policy. Here's what we expect of you. Here's acceptable and unacceptable use. And here's what would happen to you if you don't follow the policy.
So we started with more of the guidance of the, at the procedure level, but then we get into more like, if you really need to have this spelled out for you because it's complicated, well, here's the IKEA version of steps 1 through 15 because James was hit by the bus.
Correct. Yeah, there's definitely that you can have in place. And also it depends on how complicated are some of your solution stacks, and also, do I only have tier 3s working on my systems? If so, I don't need to explain how to reset a password. But if I'm doing something, say, for an employee, perhaps I have those steps in there. So your policies and your procedures can be dynamic and relative to who's going to use them.
You need to know your audience, essentially.
Correct.
So this gets into sort of a segue I'd like to say is where MSPs are going to be dramatically different than the clients. And so we get this a lot. We get this probably, I'm going to say 75% of the time, where a client needs help with a policy or a procedure or guidance. They got to respond to a questionnaire from an insurance company, you name it. And they're like, hey, you're our MSP. Can you just provide us what you do for us or what you guys use? And it's like, I can. Is that valuable? And the answer, I think, in probably 9 out of 10 times is like, no, absolutely not, because I have written this policy for my organization and my employees, my audience doesn't need me to go, well, first you right click on the start menu or whatever, and kind of spell those things out, because I am working with an employee base that I wouldn't have probably hired them if on the level 1 help desk side, they couldn't at least do those types of changes. Right.
Absolutely.
And now you've got a client that's like, hey, I've got these awesome MSP policies. I don't even know what they're for, but I'm going to send this to my insurance company. And now my insurance coverage is based on an MSP who is not the one that signed off or is writing the check to the insurance provider.
Correct.
Man, so when we go back to this defining the why any of this? Because I think I'm struggling with this risk component that says risk now I should lead with what is the risk, like the why, so that I can make better decisions both for my client and for myself as far as what gaps do we need to address first, what kind of effort should we put into this, and whether or not we should do it at all. I mean, really, right? Like, if doing it at all should be what we start with, because that's how we help the client wrap their heads around the fact that we're doing this for them, not because we just want to bill them.
Yeah, when you address risk, there's 4 ways that you can handle it. Something in a business, you can avoid it, which is the best way. If like myself, I just avoid riding a motorcycle because I've got kids and such. Right now, I just avoid that risk altogether.
Right. You can transfer it.
You can mitigate it, where we put in controls like a SIM solution or antivirus or so on and so forth. Then you can transfer it to insurance companies or to somebody else. And then finally, you just accept.
Right.
You just accept the risk as it is. Now, for those of you out there that had the CISSP and say, well, there's actually like 6 ways. No, they complicated it. There's 4.
Right.
There's only 4. And you don't ignore risk. You just accept it in ignorance. If you decide not to ever look at it. So when we look at those 4 ways, that's where, when we're identifying the risk, identifying the why, we can identify what's the best way to approach this risk. And a lot of times, if we can, let's avoid something for a business. So now we don't have the risk. You're not spending the money on it. You're not having to train people on it, so on and so forth. And then as we can, we mitigate in the best way and then transfer what we can and so on and so forth, all down the stack.
Well, I think with a lot of the MSPs that are going to listen to this, their audience is largely the SMB space. So to say, hey, let's go spend, money, let's just say money. We don't even say it's a lot of money. We'll just say spend money in a sentence with an SMB client. You've already got some red flags popping up, like what I'm already saying no, because I know there's money involved. the reality is, and this was a eye opener for me, is as I started spending more and more time looking at how do we address controls, particularly with CIS, there's a lot of information, especially from like the SANS Institute, that says, here's how you address the following things. And oh, by the way, zero financial out of pocket cost to address this. What they don't tell you is that for every single thing you do end up addressing, there's an employee or somebody, there's time involved. So there's a cost associated with all of it. But when you don't have to write a check or you don't have to, put money in someone else's pocket, it seems to be a lot more palatable, at least out of the gate, when we start having these conversations around things you could do to avoid or, remediate, you name it, or transfer it. But when we accept it, that's an unforeseen cost. And I think that we don't spend enough time going, hey, even internally self-reflection, like if I just accept this as is, what will this cost me if something were to happen that I could have addressed?
Absolutely.
Which goes back to the why. If we know the why, then these things that we're willing to accept start to become very clear for everybody in the organization.
Correct. And then you can make informed decisions. We're going this way because, and that supports any auditor that you ever sit with, whether it be a government regulator or for a certification. You can
Right.
clearly say, here's why we're doing this. We
Which
evaluated
is which is interesting, because most every MSP that's going to listen to this has dealt with the helping a client or themselves filling out that insurance questionnaire. And one of the things I have to hammer, sometimes beat over the head, is if you say not applicable or not applicable, I like to add syllables to words for some reason. But if it's not applicable to you, then the question is, did you put down the why it's not applicable in that notes field that's obviously not there just to fill up the page? It is literally there for you to put an answer. If it says comments and you're leaving that blank on a no or not applicable, or even a yes, right? Like there's no answer that you can put on those questionnaires that doesn't have comments or the notes field getting filled in with something.
Yeah. And that now that's so dangerous to not fill that stuff out, because insurance companies are starting to really take a look at, okay, this is what you filled out. Were you doing that? Are we going to pay the claim? And MSPs, especially with like HIPAA and such, are getting dragged into, hey, they helped us fill this out. They're culpable as well. What risk are you exposing yourself to as the MSP by filling these things out in that way?
Right. And like you said, you're not an attorney. I'm not an attorney. So I'm not going to fill it out on your behalf. The closest I've come to filling one out is I have been on the over the shoulder Zoom conference call where I've given some, hey, I don't know that I would word it that way because that it implies something that I don't think you mean. Again, and before you submit this, it might be in your best interest to have an attorney look it over. Because again, despite where I might have stayed last night, that is not going to help you if you get audited and they find something wrong with this. Or there's a breach, right? Like where the insurance company's like, well, we're not paying that. You said right here on, number 3 that you didn't do anything because it wasn't applicable. And yet that's exactly why this breach occurred.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, listen, James, it has been a pleasure as always defining the why. I don't know why we didn't do this sooner, because I have struggled with what the why is for a really long time as I go about my business, filling in gaps for organizations that haven't told me what the why or what's important to them, but have said yes in many cases to security products and services that I could plug in and solve problems for them. But then again, two sides of the same coin. It's a question, though, ultimately it comes back to, if we don't address or look at the risk for what it is, then over time, we could feasibly be putting money, products, services, time into places that are really not the best way to approach it, because we're just not doing what's needed to keep the business, optimal.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
James, where can people find you if they're looking for more input from James with regards to risk and I'll just say the defining the why?
Defining the why. I'm always input output .tech, TECH is a great way to get our contact information. And I'm always happy to have people email me directly, info@inputoutput.tech. Always happy to be a resource, and help you navigate that why and point you in the right direction.
James, I appreciate it. This has been an episode of MSP 1337. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you, Chris.